Morning, everybody, and happy Friday. I am going to give a quick introduction to our host today. So first we have Jens. If you haven't met Jens yet, he's our managing director out in our Springboat Steamboat offices in Vail area. He's been in the luxury resort market for more than 20 years. He also has a lot of public relations experience and marketing experience in the real estate industry. So we're really excited to have him here. And we've also got Robert with us today. Robert is also in Steamboat. He began real estate back in 2006. He jumped into the top producing agents in his office really quickly and became one of the leaders in the Steamboat Springs market. In 2008 is when he joined us at Coldwell Banker, and in 2015 is when he became a member of the Tom Ferry coaching organization and also founded Team Yazbeck. So we are really excited to have both of them here. I'm going to go ahead and let Jen take it away now. So go ahead, Jen.
All right. Well, Shannon, thanks for that introduction. And obviously Robert's here. He is an expert negotiator. So today we're going to talk about some tactics, pitfalls, and strategies for negotiation. So with that, we'll get started. So Robert, what are some of the most common situations where negotiations come into play in real estate?
First, thanks for having me, and thanks for having me on this topic, because I really enjoy negotiations. It's something that excites me about the business. So, all right. So, what are some common situations where negotiations are necessary? I would say everywhere in a real estate transaction, right? I think negotiations are, around every corner and important at every stage of a transaction. And basically, you got to just accept the fact that you're always negotiating. Kind of whether you like it or not, you're always selling, you're always negotiating. And somebody said they can barely hear. Is that on my end? You guys hear me okay?
Maybe on your end. I'm good.
Okay, cool. Somebody just let me put it in the chat. Anyway, I think we get focused on the one maybe big negotiation in the transaction or something, dealing with the other side, right? Dealing with the other agent or something like that. But there's negotiations with, your client, the other client. There's negotiations with all of the vendors, all of the, title company. Sometimes you got to negotiate with the spouses of the buyer or the girlfriends, sometimes even their kids, so I think just about every moment, every step, there's an opportunity.
So negotiations are all around you, basically, in this industry and probably throughout most of the rest of our lives, right? But can you walk us through some successful strategies and things that you've, focused on in your past to get a favorable outcome for your client?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll run you through a few here and then I'll expand on them. I would say you've got to be open. That's probably, one of the most important things, and I'll elaborate on that. You got to be creative. You got to be nice. You got to be thorough, and you got to be careful, and you got to ask lots of questions. That's my top, 5 or 6 there. So being open, I think, is super important. A lot of people get too focused and closed-minded on, the one outcome they're looking for or whatever, or the one thing somebody said, or believing a buyer, making the mistake of believing a buyer or believing a seller or something like that, right? You got to be open to lots of different outcomes. You got to be open to the fact that, what someone said 5 minutes ago isn't what they really meant, and it's not what's, they're going to do in the end. So being really open-minded and kind of fluid and neutral, is the way to go, because you got to be able to pivot, right? And if you're too close-minded and you're only focused on this one thing, then it's really hard to hear some other information that allows you to pivot. So that's super important. And then kind of ties into being creative, right? I mean, you really got to think outside the box, and you got to be taking in the information, right? And hearing the answers to the questions you're asking and asking the right questions to be able to come up with, creative, solutions or next steps that you hadn't thought of before that moment.
That's probably a pretty good segue then. Just how do you prepare for that? I mean, what are some of the things that you go through mentally or exercises that you do to get kind of ready for a negotiation?
Yeah. Do you mind if I elaborate on the last couple?
No, go to it.
Okay. So be nice. I think that one's super important. a lot of people think that you got to be tough to be a good negotiator. I think that's complete bullshit. I think the people that think they're tougher than everybody else are oftentimes not that good at negotiators because they're not paying attention to other stuff. So I think really be nice is important, and be thorough is about, gathering all the details right and really understanding that every little detail could be the one that really matters. And obviously ask lots of questions. Okay, so how do you prepare for negotiation? I think you gather all the information you possibly can, right? And really don't think anything is too small, right? And no piece of information, no detail is too small to have the potential of being the thing that changes the negotiation or, fixes it or whatever. And then get very clear on what the goal is. You really got to understand where you're trying to go, what the goal is, and not be stuck on being right. That's what I learned in a real estate negotiations course a long time ago. I think it's one of the most important things. You can't be stuck on being right. Because if you're so concerned about being right, you can oftentimes miss the goal, right? Or miss the outcome that would be acceptable for everybody. You gotta let go of the fact that what you thought might be true, even if you are right, you know what I mean? And the other side is never going to figure out that you're right, that you're wasting your time worrying about being right. And then I think you got to think about some possible objections, right? Ahead of time, ahead of going into a, heavy negotiation, and talk about how you're going to handle them. Think about how you're going to handle them. Try to, kind of foresee as much of the, possible outcomes as possible. And then role play, right? Talking about preparation. If you really got a serious negotiation coming up and you have the luxury of, being able to create the time to prepare for it, role play. Grab somebody and run through it with them ahead of time.
That makes a ton of sense. And obviously preparation is key in all things. What are some common mistakes that you see people make when they go into a negotiation situation?
Yeah, so we talked about one, it's getting stuck on being right. You gotta let go of that completely, right? It makes you a much better negotiator. And then this is one that drives me crazy. Asking for what you don't want, right, is a mistake that people do a lot. Like, for instance, they will say, you're not going to come up anymore on your price, are you? Right? Versus, any chance you come up more on your price, right? And people ask for like what they don't want a lot of times. And so they're just kind of like accepting defeat. And the answer to you're not going to come up on your price, are you, is no, right? I mean, it's a very simple answer for the other party. Whereas, is there any chance you'd come up on your price? Makes them think, and, you get the, hopefully get the outcome you want. And then believing anything anyone says. That's the other thing to not do, right? They say buyers are liars and sellers are worse, or whatever, that whole thing. I think it's very true. And it's not about, that people can't be trusted and that everybody's, lying intentionally, right? But it's really about the emotions and the, dynamics of a real estate transaction for a buyer or seller, families or whatever. It's major stuff, and people they can't always keep their cool. They can't always tell the truth, and they might change their mind later, right? So accepting what your buyer says, this is one of the things I've been trying to get through to my team. And one of the harder things that has been to, relay to my team is like when the buyer says, I'm not going over 1.5, right? Just in one ear, out the other, because they might go over 1.5. You know what I mean? They're telling you that now. And if you believe it, and if you're that rigid and you're thinking that they're like, oh, they're not going over 1.5, right? Then that's how you lose, and you give up too early, and you don't pay attention and be creative and that kind of thing. So don't believe anyone because everyone's mind can be changed. Here, I'll give you a little resource. Phil Jones. I know Todd's been talking about him too, but Exactly What to Say by Phil Jones. It's not specifically for negotiations, but key book to help you learn what to say, how to say it, to help, influence and gain your fair advantage.
So I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I mean, let's talk about motivations, right? Because I think sometimes agents maybe have a tendency to just assume that a motivation is face value, right? That it's just a sale or to get, talk about some motivations maybe that you've come across in your career that sort of surprise you and make you keep your mind open to, motivations that buyers or sellers may have.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely critical. You got to understand everybody's motivation as best as you possibly can, like their why, right? And I think you've got to revisit it often and kind of update it as much as necessary, right? Yeah, like you said, there's people have all sorts of different motivations. We just put a double-sided property under contract that I'll hit on a couple times here because it had a lot of fun pieces. But one of the main things that was holding the thing up was the seller's wife, who was not even on title, donates this condo that they don't even use to Strings, which is a local music, classical music venue deal here at Steamboat. And they donate it to the artists, and the musicians that come into town. And that was it. I mean, that was the thing holding them up. Like, that was the thing that almost didn't get the deal done, is that this lady, donates their condo that they don't even use to a nonprofit, for musicians that are in town. So if we hadn't asked enough questions, we wouldn't have understood that, and can't work around that with numbers or, whatever, anything else. So yeah, understanding motivation is super important, and don't assume you understand them just by someone saying, I'm only going to this price, or I got to have this date, or whatever. You got to dig deeper and ask why over and over, right? Until you really understand it. And a lot of times you got to help the other side understand their client's motivations too, right? And we're just talking about, obviously, the buyer seller negotiation here for the most part, but a lot of times the other agent doesn't understand their client's negotiations well enough to inform you or to represent them well, right? So sometimes you got to help them ask the questions of their clients so they understand, so then you understand. And then if the negotiation goes on, you got to re-up with people on, so you're still trying to do this, right? And we're still trying to get here, and this is still the reason, and all that, to remind them, and sometimes kind of let them update what the real motivation is. And if you ask enough times, sometimes you'll get the real answer several days later.
I mean, so with that, one of the things that I was going to ask you is, can you talk to us about, or give us a real world example of a negotiation that you were a part of that you thought was circling the drain, and then somehow you revived it? And how did that happen?
Yeah. I'll tell you about the same one. It's not, ultra complicated or whatever, but I think it's got a fun twist. Shout out to Sarah on my team if she's on the call. It was a double-sided deal we just put under contract, and she circle dialed to find the buyer. We put their place under contract, and then I circle dialed to find the seller. So they were both like buyer need situations where we were calling specific developments, cold calling, and asking for a specific buyer if anybody was interested in selling. And the same folks that were donating their condo to Strings. And at first it just seemed like the price wasn't going to work. I mean, the guy basically told me no on the phone, not interested in selling, and until I asked a bunch more questions and called him back and offered to go do a CMA and just give him value and do stuff for free and connect with him, right? Build the rapport, make the connection. It wasn't until then that I even uncovered the fact that he was a possible seller, and then several conversations later, I figured out the thing about Strings, that was their biggest holdup. Early on, I felt like the price was too high. I realized that now I do know his motivation. So he may be interested in selling, but he's like, we don't even care. You know what I mean? And this guy was interesting because this guy he said he's negotiated like hundreds of millions of dollars, one transaction, like oil and gas. So he's like, yeah, try negotiating a $400 million deal. You know what I mean? Later on, he started opening it up to me, and I'm like, ooh, this guy's sad.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. And so he tells me that, and his price is really, really high. So I'm like, all right, this is a shot in the dark. You know what I mean? But we're going to take it. We're going to keep going, learn more about him, figure it out. So we went and did the CMA, got him the value. We put the value kind of high, right? Because we told him we were going to give him a ridiculous offer. These people are not bottom feeders. They're 1031 buyers. They need to, they need to buy this property. They're willing to pay more than market rate, right? So again, setting up for failure basically is what I felt,
Yeah.
So the spin is thought it was going down the drain, like you said, didn't think there was any chance. And then we got to the really hard hurdle of her strings donation. We worked around that by figuring out, that we could just delay the closing and allow her to donate her condo to Strings this summer, right? So she was okay with her current commitment. And then lo and behold, we told him it was worth like $1.6 million to $1.7 million, but we thought he was going to hold out for $1.8 million, right? We sent him the offer at $1.6 million and he takes it as long as we could work around the thing with Strings.
Wow. Understanding a hidden motivation, certainly, right?
Yeah. And his wife was in charge, and he calls me back and he's like, well, apparently money doesn't matter. He's like, if you can figure out how to keep the Strings thing going, we'll take the 1.6.
Amazing. Well, and I was going to transition into asking you about building rapport with the other side anyway. And so obviously agents that are on the other side of deals, but that seems like one where obviously rapport kind of took you a long way.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it was easy in the end, right? I mean, that's another one of my points about negotiations. It doesn't have to be difficult, right? I mean, we just kept asking questions, kept talking, kept building rapport, kept taking the next little step, delivering value to the guy. And in the end, what we thought was going to be the hardest part was nothing. It was the easiest part. Like it just came together. Very
cool. So talk about building rapport with the other side in terms of other agents in the market.
Yeah, I mean, you got to get to know people. You got to be real, I think, and you got to be really like authentically interested in what's going on. Not just be there to get your number and get your commission and make the next call or whatever. I think you got to take the time. You got to slow down. You got to be yourself, and you got to be actually interested in what's going on, and let everybody know that you care about their emotions, right, and their motivations. And that you're seeking a favorable outcome for all parties, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of times, again, going back to I feel like the stereotype about negotiations is that you got to be tough, you got to push people around and stuff, to be a good negotiator. But that makes people defensive in my experience, and mm-hmm. It's no fun and it's rarely a win-win, If you can surprise the other side by letting them know that you actually care about their motivations and the outcome as it, pertains to them as well, kind of lets everybody's guard down and gives you a better runway.
For sure. And I was thinking about that too. Obviously the emotions that you carried with like kind of being off-putting and coming in hard charging, but talk to me about like, how do you deal with emotions? Obviously a lot of times a real estate transaction has emotion tied to it, whether it's financial or, family home or whatever it is. How do you deal with emotions in a rational situation?
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one. I don't think you can teach that in a course, dealing with your own emotions, anybody's guess. I think we've all lost our cool. It happens, all the time. Do your best to stay calm and be prepared, and not be too attached to the outcome and be open-minded, right? And don't necessarily think an objection or a wall, right, or a big hurdle that you weren't expecting is the end of the deal, is part of the way to control your own emotions. But that's a very personal thing, I think. Controlling other people's emotions, I think part of that is just to listen, right? If people are going to get excited, if they're going to get excited, and you got to just be prepared for that, but you got to let them get it out, right? You got to let people freak out and get upset and do whatever and listen, right? And acknowledge their point, maybe even agree with them if you can, or, at least acknowledge kind of where they're coming from. And that oftentimes will, kind of cool down the situation and allow you to kind of reset. And then you got to ask questions, right? You got to re-up on, what their why is and why we're here, and how do we work around the challenges.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it was you and I were talking, preparing for this. We talked about a little bit how negotiations, we're all negotiating things every day in every part of our life, right? And it's like so many of these things I can see about how they escalate even in a family situation or whatever. And it's like maybe if you just apply just being a good person and listening and kind of being open-minded, that carries over right into negotiations in
Absolutely.
a real estate deal.
No question.
Talk to me about compromise, because obviously we all know that, I mean, to come into a negotiation with the mindset of I don't have to win, or I don't have to be right, that does require compromise. So talk to me about that. And what do you think are some appropriate concessions for people to be considering when they go into a negotiation situation?
Yeah, I think negotiations are compromise, right? I mean, I think the two terms are almost interchangeable. People too wrapped up in winning, like we talked about, and being more convincing than the other party. But I think the best negotiations are when both parties feel like they won something, right? Like when it's a win-win. And an easy way to get there again is to not be attached to the outcome, right? Be fluid the entire time, help both parties come together, and constantly compromise. I mean, that's the number one thing about it, in my opinion. And in any concessions, right? I mean, don't be too rigid about what the concessions are. Be open to anything,
Yeah, can you give us an example of something that you wouldn't have thought that would get a deal done, but it did? Or
yeah, I mean, I don't know. This one's fresh on my mind. I think just figuring out the donation to strings for this lady and how to retain that, is a perfect example. I don't know if I can think of any other specifics off the top.
That's all right. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but that is a good one, right? Because again, like you said, like you would have thought that it was money motivation, but at the end it was an honor and a commitment to a nonprofit that they had. So,
right. And a lot of time it's timing, right? I mean, a lot of time it's not the money, it's not even necessarily the terms, it's the timing, and it's other people's fears, right? Like understanding what people are scared of and what their big hang up is in the process. Oftentimes it's easy to work around, right? Or make the right concession if you understand what the actual issue is. So I think asking lots of questions to understand, because right now, I guess a good example, and this has happened multiple times, is the sellers are afraid they're not going to be able to find a house if they sell, right? That's one of our biggest objections right now. So helping them figure out how to build in the time to delay the closing or delay the possession or whatever they need to do, and working with both parties to bring that together can make or break a deal.
what about situations where there are multiple parties? I mean, obviously we all are very familiar with bidding wars. And so how do you handle that?
That's some of my favorite times in the business. Having multiple offers, I think is exciting and, thrilling, and definitely a place where you need to be a good negotiator. But again, I mean, I really go against some of the norms on this. I think for sellers, I think it's real important to, respect the buyers that you have that come to the table. If you got multiple offers, you're representing the seller. And I would just flat out say, don't do highest and best. Pretty much ever. Like that tactic, I think is terrible. It's a bad start to a real estate transaction, and a negotiation. I think you've got to, be careful what you tell each party and how you time it, right? And we're talking about agency, right? I'm representing the seller. So one of the most important things I think to understand is when you can say what, right? And you got to communicate with your seller on that to understand what they want you to say and when, right? You don't actually have to tell the other side that you have multiple offers, for instance, right? A lot of people think that they just have to do that, but it's up to the seller, what they want you to say. I mean, you're an agent, right? You're a vault. If they want you to be, right? You can make the other party guess all they want, or you can give some information out with the seller's, permission that will help negotiate, right? So it's a whole nother, class, right? To talk about multiple offers, but hopefully that makes a little bit of sense, right? So my favorite example, really, you get 2 or 3 offers, and instead of saying highest and best, right? Okay, everybody, thanks for your offers, it's like, I won't put my middle finger on the screen, but it's when you say that, it's pretty much like giving them all the finger and going, screw you, give us your highest and best by Friday,
Mhm.
Instead, I think you got to be real articulate and understand which offer is the best and why, and who the seller wants to work with, right? And then let's assume they're different. You know what I mean? You got 3 different offers. If you do highest and best, you risk pissing off and pushing away the best offer, right?
Yep.
Because you're giving the middle finger equally to all 3 parties at that point, So you got to figure out which offer the seller cares about the most. And then the way I like to do it is I just go back to that one party and counter with whatever the seller wants. And we may or may not tell the other buyers we even have multiple offers, right?
Mhm.
You decide that with your seller, how they want to handle that. And, oftentimes one will have a better price, one will have better terms, one will be cash, one will be loan, whatever. It's not always the one offer that's better in all ways, right? But you can go back to that one seller, and maybe in this case, you tell them there is multiple offers, but hey, we're going to work with you, right? This is my favorite scenario. There's multiple offers, but we're going to work with you either because you were the first one in, or you're cash, you have the better terms, or whatever. The seller wants to work with you. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you a really short window to respond back, but we're not going to talk to anybody else until you respond back. So now they feel honored and respected and, excited, and they think they got a shot.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
at that point, you counter wherever you want to counter, right? You say, hey, this other offers cash, this other one's way higher than yours, whatever, you know what I mean? We just hit the market. We're going to need over asking, you know what I mean? And then you just craft the perfect counter for your seller to that one buyer, and it works almost every time. And then if it doesn't, you got a short window, right? And then you can oftentimes go to the next party before their acceptance deadline passes too. So you can often stagger these things to 3 different buyers within the acceptance deadline of all of them without anybody necessarily even knowing there's multiple offers or, feeling like they're in a bidding war or whatever.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
It's great advice. Absolutely.
Okay.
So I think we're probably getting close to our
buyers. You want to talk buyers too? Or
Yeah, let's talk buyers. Talk buyers.
All right. So buyers, you got to ask lots of questions. You got to listen, right? You got to find their why, be creative, all the stuff we've talked about. And you got to understand the other party's why, right? I mean, you got to buddy up with the listing agent. That's one of the things we talk about a lot. You know what I mean?
All right.
And that happens throughout the year, right? I mean, be cool with your fellow agents in your market, buddy up with them as much as you can, right? I mean, it's a 2-sided business, so it's hard to do sometimes, right? But if you can do that, it pays off, right? So you build rapport with the agents ahead of time. We're in small markets, at least, right? It's more possible. So you want to buddy up with that listing agent, right? And figure out what they want, what's really going on, and, kind of get them on your side and let them know you're on their side. I think is a big deal, because unfortunately a lot of listing agents they'll favor the buyer's agent they like more.
Well, and you're exactly right. I mean, we're in small markets, Vail, Steamboat, Summit County. And so, smaller MLSs, we do know a lot of the agents. So like that continued rapport over years and years where the guy that played on your softball team that you didn't think was ever going to, end up being on the other side of a deal. It's amazing how those things work out, huh?
100%. Yep. And help your buyer stay in tune with their motivations, and then just be super creative about what you're willing to present as an offer, gaining as much information from the listing agent as you possibly can, right? To understand every little piece, to be able to potentially make one little change or craft your offer, right? Again, the example of the lady that wanted to donate weeks to strings, you know what I mean? Like, the other guy could have been at 1.8 if there was multiple offers on that deal, but needed to close in 2 weeks, and she'd have taken the 1.6 closing in, 3 months after she donates her condo to strings.
Yep.
So understanding all that and being willing to craft the offer very creatively, strip out whatever contingencies are necessary to, present the best offer for the specific seller in the specific situation.
Yeah, and I think if I just listening to you talk, I mean, the 2 things that really stick out to me are listen, ask questions. And the third is maybe remembering that a negotiation really is a compromise.
100%.
All right. Well, I don't have any other questions of you. I mean, I know we could have a whole other class on any one of these questions, but is there anything else that you want to add before we?
I would say I'll close with don't be afraid to sell, right? At some point, you got to be a salesperson. You gather all the information, you're open, you know what I mean? But when it comes down to it, sometimes you got to really sell your point or, you know, your outcome or your idea or whatever. And be open to the fact that not all negotiations are difficult, right? Go in being open to the easy outcome and the easy solution.
I love it. Don't try too hard.
Right, exactly. Sometimes less is more.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's what we have for today, is it not?
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.